Hi, this is Joe Hawk. My research has been on using the sociocultural approach in diverse classrooms. Um, when we read the McIntyre article on the sociocultural perspectives on children with reading difficulties in the Handbook of Reading Disability Research earlier this semester, it really struck me that there was this lack of data concerning the effectiveness of this sociocultural approach to teaching in, quote, real classrooms with a diverse population of students. So, since this is a research interest of mine, I decided to focus in on information related to this approach since 2011, which is when the article was published, and primarily with English learners. So I used McIntyre's article to kind of provide a foundation for my research, and she detailed three basic elements of sociocultural theory as it applies to literacy instruction and research. And the first is that reading is a social process. The second is that research involves school and out of school contexts. And the third is that researchers analyze how reading is affected by social relationships. So, social context, these are words that appear over and over in all of the literature related to sociocultural theory, of course. So there are about five specific elements of the sociocultural view of reading. This is taking the former and focusing in a little bit more. The first one is called the deficit view. And this view of students is rejected in the sociocultural view. So basically, instead of looking at students who come to the classroom as having deficits because of their culture, because of their limited language skills, or whatever else, the sociocultural view would say every student comes with something that they can use that we can build on. So we would reject in a sociocultural view of reading. We would reject that students have a deficit at all. And instead, we would, in culturally responsive teaching, view these cultural differences as assets and in which learning communities value diverse cultures and heritage. So everything in the culturally responsive classroom would welcome other cultures and other heritages. A fundamental idea of this, a fundamental aspect, is the funds of knowledge. And in that view, even the very young students bring to school with them rich literacy, social, and cultural experiences that can be leveraged in their learning. The idea of funds of knowledge, I think, is really critical to sociocultural teaching because that fund of knowledge that the students are bringing with them is that asset that they have, something that can be built on and leveraged in their learning. I really like this quote by Chenowith. I think it's really kind of boils down, the whole idea of sociocultural teaching. Every student's perspective is valuable, regardless of race, creed, or cultural background. All viewpoints are essential to creating democracy. And I think that that's referring to democracy in the classroom, but I mean, very much more than that. We are living in a society where this could apply at every level, and maybe it's always been that way, but it seems to be in the forefront today, especially. Another sociocultural view of reading is that the context of the reading process is everything, but what is inside the mind of the reader. So, in this view, the mind of the reader is where the reading is taking place, and everything outside of that is the context. So not only the classroom that the student is reading in or learning to read in, but also the other students in the classroom, the way the groupings are, whether the student is working individually or in small groups or half of the classroom. Um, Also beyond that, so the school environment would be part of the context. The city would be part of the context. The country would be part of the context. And in diverse classrooms, really, it could be the whole world as the context because all of those individual students are bringing these, other cultures, these assets, these valuable funds of knowledge into the classroom, creating this context, this culture within which the reading is taking place. So the sociocultural approach focuses on culture as a context in which learning takes place. According to Wehrmuth, teachers have the overwhelming responsibility for creating safe spaces where reading and writing can take place within these cultural contexts, no matter how diverse they are. Another element of the sociocultural view of reading is that cultural tools help students mediate learning. This idea of cultural tools can refer to language, can refer to gestures, which can be different in different cultures. The prime example used in most of the literature is scaffolding in the ZPD, which is the zone of proximal development, as discussed by Vygotsky in the studies. Chenowith explained that cultural scaffolding involves using the cultures and cultural experiences of students to help manage and increase their academic performance. So this idea of scaffolding is a little bit different from the normal view of scaffolding, where we're taking languages, and providing a bridge from a student's native language into the new language that he or she is learning. It's very similar because the cultural scaffolding is also a bridge. And sometimes it may be using comparison and contrast to show the differences between how we do things and how they do things, and how both are valid and valued. They're just different. So I think it's a matter of with sociocultural this approach. Um, it's a matter of not just the language, but the broader culture, in the scaffolding and the all of the instruction. Another element of the sociocultural view of reading is that knowing students' academic and cultural background is crucial to knowing their stage. And this refers to their stage in the reading process, the reading proficiency, so that we can't really understand where a student is in their proficiency in reading or in language without understanding their background. We have to know where they're coming from in order to reach them there, and to know what the next step is, so we can design that model for that individual student's zone of proximal development, so we know exactly where to place the instruction so that they are able to learn without frustration, but also have to stretch a little bit so the learning is in place. Stewart and Hanson Thomas studied transnational experiences. This was a very interesting study that I read about, and there weren't a lot of studies that were specifically studies since 2011. A lot of the literature, just as a sidebar here, I'll get to this later, but a lot of the literature was um, case study, and this one was as well. But there were a lot of just basically essays that were kind of pulling together the research from the past, prior to 2011, literature that McIntyre, which is the foundation for my research, would have had access to in 2011. So this one was exciting because it was a case study that that was published in 2016, and they studied transnational experiences that were evident in the participants' life and literacies, and the effects of instructional techniques that were based on knowledge of these experiences. The participant was a 16-year-old Mexican American ninth grade student in a suburban U.S. school. And I thought it was really interesting the work that they did with her. But the translanguaging that she was able to use in the classroom, meaning kind of transitioning between her native language and the new language she was learning, it enabled her to express her identity as a, quote, transnational bilingual. And that adapted instruction really did deepen her creativity and her use of higher order thinking skills. They were able to show that. I wish that they had done a little more research, a little more like quantitative research where they had a baseline. Maybe it was a case study, I know, but I would have preferred, since it was such a great study, I wish that they had possibly looked into doing a mixed method study and added that quantitative piece so we could see whether her reading proficiency had improved in some way. The sociocultural view of reading, that's next, this is another element, is called sociolinguistic variables. And these impact reading success in so many ways. There's a huge chart right here that McIntyre presented about community variables, family variables, school variables. I thought it was really interesting. The family variables are very, they've been shown to be uh, very important in the literacy of students, especially the socioeconomic background. But the families, their parents specifically, literacy practices at home, they said was even more important to the success of students in learning to read and otherwise be literate. Culturally relevant literacy instruction, according to Chenowith, should connect classroom learning to the student's world. So it reflects the values of the student's own culture. I thought that was a really important connection to those variables. She also recommended having students create ethno-autobiographies to explore their cultural backgrounds and share them with the class. This was a very interesting idea. I'm actually thinking about using this with my ninth graders this year. I love the idea of bringing culture into the classroom. And even though I don't have a whole lot of language learners this year, I have I'm sure I will, because I always have a very diverse group of students who have a lot of different cultural backgrounds, even though they're all situated in the same place. So I would like to explore this a little bit. Here's the quote from the family's socioeconomic status. The SES appears to be the best predictor of academic achievement and failure for a student. However, the socioeconomic status is less important than the parents' literacy practices. I think that's very important to let our families know, and give them some tools that they can use early in life. Sociocultural approach to instruction. This term can be also used as this culturally responsive instruction or culturally relevant pedagogy. This chart that I've found in Alexandru was very interesting. This researcher decided to study the terminology and other relevant details related to intercultural pedagogy versus pedagogy of sociocultural diversity. And I thought it was interesting that, even though they seem very similar, there were some very different elements here. The idea of the starting point I thought was really important, where this quote intercultural pedagogy starts with one single culture, and then all the others disrupt the order, and there's a me, and then there's an other. And I really like the idea of the pedagogy of sociocultural diversity a lot, because the effect of the foreign context provides the enriching perspective. That's definitely what we're looking at here with the sociocultural approach. Another factor in sociocultural approach to instruction is that teachers can alter the curriculum and instruction so that school culture better matches students' natal culture or their birth culture. Another really interesting study that I read about was Nemati and Arabmofrad. They studied the effects of instruction type and learner grouping on both awareness and production of, quote, speech acts, basically, the act of speaking. The instruction types they use refer to input and output-based instruction. And so input is about awareness of speech, and output is about production. So input would be listening and reading, and then output would be speaking or writing. The groupings that they used were individual or collaborative. So this is what they were looking for. And they called the collaborative peer scaffolding, which I thought was interesting, because the peers were scaffolding for each other. The expert, quote, expert peers were scaffolding for their less expert partners. In this study, there were 90 freshman Iranian EFL, English as a Foreign Language, learners, and they were separated into 4 treatment groups and 1 control group. So the 4 treatment groups were basically, you had input, individual, I think they called them individual input, individual output, and then they had collaborative input and collaborative output. And so they mixed them up that way so they could study all of those elements. And they found that the input-based group and the output-based group scored significantly higher than the control group. So both of those, where the students were expected to, to learn in those 2 ways, were better than nothing, just, reading and silently. The second finding was that both of the collaborative groups performed better than the individual groups, which provides some evidence for the social aspect. And then number 3, the collaborative input group made the most progress. So they were working together, they were reading, they didn't have to have any output, but somehow reading together helped them to make the most progress. I thought that was very interesting. Another researcher, Han, recommended peer-to-peer, quote, interactive dialogues. He included in this terminology group discussion, writing interest groups, peer writing revision, and all of these were designed to help students socialize with others who had similar proficiency. So this is a little different from the previous study where they had expert peers paired with less expert novice peers. In this, he's recommending that the proficiency of partners or groups be similar so that they would have more of a social aspect rather than a teacher-student kind of set up, even though they were both students. Another element of sociocultural approach to instruction, according to McIntyre, is that teachers can alter their own discourse, their own way of speaking or communicating to reflect students' styles of discourse. I did not find any evidence for this in the literature, so I was not able to add anything to that. But the next element, teachers being allowing verve, which was a new word for me, or code switching, which is the term I usually see in the classroom, I found some evidence for. In Stewart and Hanson Thomas's, I mentioned this earlier, the study of the Mexican American high school student, Paula, which was a pseudonym, this translingual bilingual, which was the term they used, wrote a poem. This was one of the instructional techniques. In the study, she wrote a poem in English using sentence frames that allowed her to use Spanish words when she felt they were a better fit. And then she translated the poem into her native Spanish. And then last, she was encouraged to write a third version of the poem that entwined the two languages. I thought that was brilliant. And I'm definitely going to try this with my language learners this year because the poem that they used in the study is George L. Lyon's Where I'm From, which is a poem that I just made copies of this week to start working on with my own students. So I'm looking forward to trying out this approach with those I have who are bilingual if they will be up to it. So in the future, research is still needed on the effectiveness of the sociocultural approach in diverse classrooms, especially with language learners. More quantitative studies related to increased proficiency due to this type of instruction are definitely warranted. There is some really good evidence, some great, case study, but I was not able to find a lot of really solid data, which is definitely what works. So thank you for listening and goodbye.